For years, I ran a business providing services to other businesses on a project basis, so I know firsthand that it's often difficult to make and enforce project agreements between service providers and their clients. A legal agreement is too expensive for most projects, so project work is usually governed by verbal agreements whose lack of clarity often leads to disputes. If one party doesn't fulfill its obligations, the other party is typically out of luck. Even where a legal agreement exists, going to court is so expensive that it only makes sense for the largest projects. The Will Work for Die blockchain app addresses this problem by defining an agreement between a service provider and a client and holding the funds owed under the agreement until specific terms agreed to by both parties are fulfilled. The application enables the contractor and the client to define an agreement in less than a minute. The agreement can easily be subdivided into phases to reduce the risk to the two parties. Either party can cancel the contract, and in that case, the funds held by the contract are divided between the two parties according to the terms of the agreement. Let's take it for a spin. First step is we'll define a project by creating its phase structure. And you can see here we've got the overview of the project, the phase structure, and the client dashboard where the client interacts with the app, and the service provider dashboard for the service provider interactions. So let's start off by we'll go into the service provider dashboard and we'll define the first phase of the project, which is we'll call Create Architecture. And we'll specify a lock payment. Now the lock payment is the payment that is the service provider is guaranteed to receive for work completed, while a discretionary payment is paid only on satisfactory completion of the phase according to the client. So we'll specify a lock payment of 3 die and a discretionary payment of 7. So now we'll create a new phase and wait a second for the blocks to be mined, and then we'll hit refresh. And we can see we've got the first phase in our phase structure. Looking at the status, it has not yet been started, nor has it been approved. So now we'll create another phase, and we'll call it Write Smart Contracts. And we'll specify a lock payment of 10 ETH and a discretionary payment of 20 ETH. Create that phase and refresh. So now we've got a very small project defined. And before we can go any further, the client needs to deposit the funds to start the project. So we can see we've got, for the first phase, the client needs to deposit funds to start that first phase, which would be 3 plus 7 or 10 ETH. So we'll enter the amount to deposit, click deposit, hit refresh, and we can see the client has a balance of 10 ETH. So now there's sufficient funds in the held in the client's account to start the project. So the service provider will now click Start Next Phase, and when we refresh the screen, we can see that the 10 ETH that were in the client's balance have now moved to the escrow balance. So it's now being held by the contract pending successful completion. So next step will say that the service provider has finished this first phase. Client clicks Approve Current Phase. And now we'll refresh the screen, and we can see that 10 ETH for the total payment for the first phase has now moved into the service provider balance. So it's now accessible to the service provider. So let's withdraw those funds. Service provider withdraws. And now we see the service provider's balance is down to zero because service provider has withdrawn those funds. Now to start, before we can start the second phase, the client needs to deposit a total of 30 ETH for the locked-in discretionary payment. So we'll make that deposit. We'll refresh the screen after the blocks are mined. And we can see the client balance is 30 ETH. So now the service provider can start the next phase. And we see that, refresh the screen here, we'll see the 30 ETH has moved into the escrow balance. So it's being held by the contract again, pending successful completion. Now we'll say that the client is not happy with this phase. So client decides to cancel the project. So now let's press cancel project and we'll see what happens. Go back, refresh the screen, and we'll see that the 30 ETH that was in the escrow balance, 10 of that has moved into the service provider's account. This is a locked payment that was locked to the guaranteed to the service provider, and that can be any amount agreed to by the two parties, while the 20 ETH that was the discretionary payment has moved back to client's account. So the client is refunded the 20 ETH because they were not satisfied, decided to cancel the project. So now with the client, we'll go in and withdraw the 20 ETH. And we can see the client balance is down to zero. And now the service provider, let's refresh that screen, service provider's balance is 10. So we will withdraw the 10 ETH. Refresh. And service provider balance is down to zero. The advantage of this approach is that the risk is to both parties is reduced because the funds are held by an impartial smart contract that releases them according to rules that have been agreed to in advance by both parties. Transaction costs, including the cost of creating and enforcing the agreement, are virtually zero. Embedding project agreements into a smart contract also creates the potential to define large numbers of smart contracts to unleash an army of freelancers to accomplish projects or goals of a magnitude that today must be handled by organizations with large numbers of employees.